Hi, my name is Sean Wildermuth with Agilitrain, and welcome to this third module of our Using Lesson SASS course. And in this section, we're going to be talking about SASS. SASS is another dynamic spreadsheet language. We're going to be going through and talking about what exactly it is, how to use it on the server, as well as covering the core features of SASS, including variables, rules, importing, extending, using mix-ins, functions, and finally control directives. Let's get started. SASS is a dynamic style sheet language, much like LESS, which we covered in Module 2. Stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. And it compiles down to CSS, much like LESS does. It introduces these programming features to CSS so that you can structure them in a way that makes them more maintainable. So SASS itself has two syntaxes, SASS and SCSS. The original SASS syntax was based on indentation, so it implied certain things about the language based on how it did nesting of indentions. This didn't look and feel like CSS, and in fact CSS wasn't valid SASS originally. And so they created a second syntax which is much more common, and it's going to be the one we're going to cover in the whole course. This syntax, called SCSS, looks and feels like CSS. It uses curly braces to imply structure, semicolons on the end of lines, etc. Much like the same sort of syntaxes that you're used to using in CSS today. So there is support for several server-side technologies, including Node.js, ASP.NET, as well as other plugins for things like Rails and JSP, etc. For Node, you can simply use the Node package manager to install SASS onto the server by requiring the SASS package and then using render to take SASS itself and then export the resulting CSS. For ASP.NET, there's a couple of ways to do integration with SASS. Chirpy is a common plugin. This is something you would install in Visual Studio as an extension, and does design time compilation. It actually takes your SASS every time you edit it and produce a CSS file that you can reference directly. It knows what files need to be processed by a convention of using Chirpy in the name of the file itself, and then the extension implies what engine they're going to use to generate it. You can find out more about Chirpy on chirpy.coplex.com. The one we'll show you here is actually a package you can install into ASP.NET via a NuGet package. If you install the SassAndCoffee package, it installs a handler in your ASP.NET project that will look for incoming requests, map them to a SASS file, and then return the resulting built CSS file. So let's see how this works. So here in Visual Studio, we have a simple form HTML file that is referencing some CSS. And let's show you how to then use SASS to solve some common problems in that CSS. First thing we're going to do is install the SassAndCoffee NuGet package. We can do this by just going to manage NuGet packages for our project, looking for it and installing it. We could also use the console like I showed in the slides. I'm going to show it here in the manage NuGet packages for the project so you know how to find it using the UI. I'm just going to type SASS and coffee into the search string, and I'm looking for online packages. And we can see it's here. And so by looking at the SassAndCoffee package, I can just press install, and it's going to install all of the requirements for SassAndCoffee and set it up in the project so that it can deliver these SASS and SCSS files. During installing of the SASS package, it's going to notice that SASS, SCSS, as well as CoffeeScript, which we aren't going to cover in this course, files aren't tied into specific editors. Depending on what plugins you have installed, I found this to be a bit buggy and a bit crashy, and so I typically don't install the file definition so that it opens it up just in a plain old editor. Once we've installed it, we can see that there have little check marks on the different parts of the project that were installed. We can come over to our project, and the project is now ready to deliver SASS. So we've got our CSS files here, and in fact our form, let me open that up, is actually pointing at these CSS files. And you might expect correctly that this will actually work. This will go out, get the CSS files, deliver them to the web page, and it'll work as is. In order to use SCSS for our language, all we need to do is go ahead and rename this to the SCSS file. This is going to warn us that changing the name is going to make it unusable, but that's not true. It can just be named SCSS for our SASS file. And if we open it, we can see that we have a standard CSS. The way that the SassAndCoffee handler works is it looks for incoming CSS requests. And if this were going to resolve to be a failed CSS, that CSS file is missing, the handler attempts to look for an SCSS or a SASS file to process and return as that CSS. So in this way, our HTML file doesn't even need to tell the resulting browser that it's even using SASS. You aren't going to leak that detail to the browser. So in fact, even though we renamed this SCSS, if we go ahead and run this, we'll see our form still works. And in fact, if we navigate to the CSS file itself, again, we're not navigating to the physical file, we're navigating to the URL that is css/my.css. This will actually contain the processed file that we were talking about. Now, how do we know this for sure? Because SCSS supports all of the CSS conventions, everything in here will simply work. You can see that there's some change to the formatting based on the processor, so it was processed. But let's actually make a change in here that we can actually see. So in my SCSS file, for HTML, instead of saying font size 14, let's say font file 10 pixels plus 8 pixels. So that's going to result in 18, but this is a calculation that the SASS processor is going to then process and leave 18 as a final size. Actually, let's make this plus 14 so we can get a nice big number of 24. If I refresh this page, we can see our font size is now 24 because the SassAndCoffee processor has run this file through, found that to be a calculation, and performed the calculation and put the result there in font size. So let's head back to the slides. The next thing we want to talk about is the variable syntax. Now in SCSS, the syntaxes all start with $, then the name of a variable, colon, and the value of the variable. In this case, we're defining a specific color that we want to use and replace inside of our SCSS file. It can also take units like 4 pixels or 1.0 em. It can also take lists, and lists are comma-separated values that are used, and you can actually do some list operations if you needed to. In this case, it's a list that contains the 2 font face names. And then finally, more complex lists like you would use for things like backgrounds and borders and those sorts of things. Within the SCSS document, you can, both in creating variables and inline, much like we did in the demo, you can use operations. So things like font size, 4 pixels plus 4, will do the appropriate inferring of what the resulting type you want. 4 pixels plus 4, it assumes you're going to want 8 pixels in that case. 20 pixels times 0.8 is going to result in the right number of pixels, etc. You can even do math against things like colors. Parentheses allow you to specify the order of operation, much like you would have in any programming language. There are some specific color functions that are also specified in SASS to support manipulating colors in common ways. We saw in the operations we could multiply it by a number, but often you want to do something more nuanced. So here, lighten and darken are functions to literally lighten or darken a color. And this may be where you don't want to pick a specific light or darker color, you just want to actually darken or lighten it by some well-known value. You can increase or decrease the saturation. You can force that color to be fade in or fade out, and this is going to change its opacity, as well as invert or even find the complementary color. There's some other functions that are important. Quote and unquote are both used to add or remove quotes from variables or other pieces of text in the CSS that have embedded quotes in them. You can also use the if function to do inline if statements. If some value is true, then choose the first option, or if it's false, choose the second option. You can also do some math functions like round, ceiling, floor, and even calculate a percentage based on a number. So another important feature here is string interpolation. We can have variables that define strings themselves, but we may want to concatenate or inject that string into another string. And the best way to do this is to actually use the syntax of a pound, curly brace, name of the variable, and curly brace to take the value of root and inject it there directly into the string. In this case, it becomes the URL where it's taken the values and injected into the string at compilation of the SASS file. In addition, you can use this interpolation anywhere inside of a SASS document. So in this case, I have a string defined as my class, and when I use this pound curly brace variable name and curly brace structure, it's going to actually place that my class directly here in the resulting output. So in fact, this would define a class, noting the period, called my class, and going to set up a rule for that specific class based on that name that we derived. Let's see how variables work in action. So here we are in Visual Studio, and let's start with the variables. Let's go ahead and create a simple variable up top. And variables, if you remember the slides, start with the $ syntax and then a name. In this case, I'm going to call it main color, a colon, and then a value. And this is going to assign this new value to main color. In this case, I'm just going to say black. Now I could assign things like black, which are colors, units, really anything that we can use inside of SASS can be used as the value of a variable here. Well, let's start with this main color, and let's solve one of our problems from Module 1, and that is that we have the same color in multiple places. So let's come down here to where we have black, and pound 000 is the same as black, and just go ahead and use this main color here instead. And let's go ahead and look for one more use, and the color of the items in the container are also black, and so I can go ahead and say main color here as well. Now if we go back up to our design here and look at the CSS, we can see that this background was replaced with the word black in both places. And this is going to tell us that processing actually took the variable and stuck it there. Let's go ahead and change this color real quick and give it just a pound value like FFEEDD. And let's refresh it, and we can see there the pound value we put in is used in both places. And this way we can get rid of the magic string problem and go ahead and create variables that represent colors as part of our design and not have to do the arduous search and replace in every case. Let's look at another example. So let's go ahead and reset our color back here to black just so our design looks correct. And let's look at creating another variable for a unit. Now, here I want to have the base size of the fonts in my form. So I'm just going to say base font size, and I'm just going to give it a size like 14. And I want to be able to use this in a number of places, like the size of our HTML. Let's see where else we're using 14. Let's come down here, and here's the nav size, which is also 14. If we go back to the browser and look at our design now, we can see that we're using that size 14 font in a number of places. We can see that it's here 14 because it's the size of the text inside of our form, as well as the size of these navigation buttons up here. So let's come over here and change this to, let's say, 24, something nice and big, and refresh, and we can see they both got very big because they're both based on that same variable. If we look at our underlying built CSS file, we can see that that new 24 is being put there, as well as the size of our nav down here. So this really allows us to do some smart things. Again, with units versus colors, it's really the same problem. But we shouldn't limit it to that. Let's also talk about using operators. Operators allow us to do operations against variable names and variable values. Much like we saw that we were adding 14 and 10 pixels in the previous section, we can do this with variables as well. So let's look at our H1, 2s, and 3s down here. And instead of using these fixed sizes, let's say base font size plus 2 plus 4 and plus 10. And this is going to then allow us, as the size of that font gets larger over the design period, that these are going to stay related to that original size. Again, it's going to look like we want it, but as we make things get bigger, we can do this certain math to figure out how we want to make the design adapt to different variables as the design goes forward. These aren't runtime variables. These aren't ones you're going to plug into a server-side formula or allow the user to select and then it magically change. These are typically going to be generated on the server and cached on the server for performance. So you're talking about managing the change for the design period only. If you remember, we have this main color equals black. What if I make the background here lighter than black, but we still want it related to that? We can actually use a color function here called lighten, and I'll say let's lighten it up by 25%. Go back to our design. We can see that this got a bit lighter. We can change it to 50% and do the same thing, and it gets even lighter. That's giving us that opportunity to make the color here based on whatever that main color of our design is. Many designs on the web really stick to either a 3, 4, 5, or sometimes maximum 6 colors in a particular design. So you end up having theme colors that are related across a whole website. This really allows you to limit where those are in a pretty concise way. The last thing I want to talk about is interpolation. Now in the slides we talked about string interpolation, and this certainly works. Let's say we wanted to create a variable up here called root path, and I'm just going to say some path that we know about as a string. Now we could certainly use this in something like a background image and say URL and then do some concatenation here. Root path plus images back.jpg. And this certainly works. What actually makes more sense and is a little easier to get your head around is that you can actually use inside of anywhere in the SASS document, you can actually use the syntax, which is pound, curly brace, and then in this case we're going to use the name of the variable, root path. And this syntax says whatever the contents between the curly braces is, place here in the outputted or generated CSS file. Let's see what this looks like. If we look at our design here, we can see that it's embedded that localhost 1000 directly here in the string without us having to do string concatenation. Now this was at the beginning of the string, so it may have not been necessary here, but it was something more embedded like the path to the image folder. That's pretty common here. One of the things you should be aware of, though, is that this works everywhere. So we could have said root path, or actually let's do this, base font size plus 15, so that what is in here is an operation now, and will still be thrown in to that string. In this case, the 29 pixel was the result of base size plus 15, 14 plus 15, 29. But more commonly, it's going to be used to actually embed strings and other strings. The last piece that's interesting is, again, since this can be used everywhere, you could even have something like base class name and then use it again anywhere. Let's say you want to define several column classes. So we could say certainly column 1, column 2, etc. But maybe you really want this to be based on something, so we can use that same syntax, pound, curly brace, base, class, name, 1, and just use this instead of the call in several places. And that way it'll embed whatever that base class name is here inside of our class declaration. And now that we have these two classes, let's go ahead and just put something in them like font, size, base, font, size. Because for the output, if there are empty class names like this, the SAS processor will actually just remove them completely from the output because they're not necessary. They don't contain anything. So you can see here that interpolation we were using goes ahead and takes that string we had as call and embeds it here in the design exactly where we wanted it. Let's head back to the slides.